The road to Briar Hollow was older than memory and darker than moonlight. Harrow drove through the mist, the tires hissing over gravel that had swallowed too many footsteps before hers. The trees leaned close, whispering secrets she almost remembered, their bare limbs brushing her windshield like pleading hands. She hadn't seen the house since she was 15, since the night her mother vanished without a sound and her father told her, "Some doors close themselves, Alara. Don't ever try to open them again." Harrow had sworn never to return to Briar Hollow. The house had a way of keeping what it loved and breaking what it didn't, and she had escaped it once before. Barefoot, bleeding, with her mother's voice fading behind her. Years had passed since then. She had made a life elsewhere, quiet and clean, where no one spoke the Harrow name or asked why she woke at night gasping for air. That was until the letter came. It arrived without a postmark, the envelope yellowed and soft, as though it had been handled by too many hands that weren't quite human. Inside was a single sheet of paper, her father's handwriting unmistakable, the sharp slant of a man too proud to beg, too proud to die. "Come home, my bride." 3 words. Nothing more. No greeting, no explanation. For a long time, Alara thought it a cruel prank. Her father had been dead for nearly a decade, buried beneath the weeping willow in the family plot. She had stood there, felt the dirt between her fingers. Yet, something about the letter's scent, that faint trace of lilacs and smoke, stirred the memory of his study, of the cracked leather chair and the way he used to hum hymns no church had ever claimed. Her hands shook as she read it again and again until the words began to blur, until it felt less like reading and more like remembering. The days that followed were restless ones. She caught glimpses of the past in mirrors, in the shifting of light against the walls. The phone rang once every night at midnight, always silent on the other end. Once, she thought she heard her name whispered, as if the house itself had found a way to call her back across the miles. When the dream started, the same corridor, the same candle burning at the foot of the stairs, she stopped resisting. It wasn't courage that sent her home. It was inevitability. The train to Harrow's crossing ran only once a day, a slow crawl through endless forests that grew thicker and older the closer she came. The other passengers avoided her eyes, their silence heavier than the fog pressing against the windows. When she stepped off the platform, the town looked exactly as it had in her childhood. Too still, too watchful. The streets smelled of dust and damp wood. Shopkeepers closed their shutters when they saw her, and an old woman muttered a prayer under her breath. No one offered directions, but she didn't need them. The path to Briar Hollow was carved into her bones. Each step forward felt like a return to something that had never truly let her go. The town of Harrow's crossing sat on the edge of the map like a smudge no one wanted to touch. Once, it had been a place of color and chatter, where the market square rang with church bells and laughter. Now it lay under a spell of silence, every building leaning inward as though listening for something they feared to hear. Alara stepped off the cracked road and onto Main Street, her footsteps echoing in the emptiness. The air tasted of iron and rain, thick with the smell of coal that hadn't been burned in years. Windows were shuttered even in daylight, and the few faces she saw vanished before she could meet their eyes. She stopped by the old general store, the same one where her mother used to buy sugar and ribbons, its wooden sign now warped and hanging by one rusted nail. The door creaked when she pushed it open, and a bell above it gave a tired jingle that seemed to echo too long. Behind the counter stood a man she didn't recognize, gray at the temples and thin as a nail. His eyes flicked to the letter in her hand, then to her face, and he froze like a man remembering a nightmare. "You're one of them," he said softly, not as a question but a curse. Alara tried to smile, to sound casual, asking for directions up to Briar Hollow. But the man's jaw clenched, his knuckles whitening around the counter's edge. "That road isn't for the living," he muttered, his gaze darting to the window as though someone might be listening. "You'll find no one up there worth finding." When she pressed him further, he only shook his head and backed away, whispering a prayer that seemed older than the town itself. She left without buying anything, the bell above the door shrieking like a warning. Outside, 2 children stood by the well, their faces pale beneath a layer of dust. One of them pointed at her and whispered to the other, "That's her. The runaway." The other child hissed, "Hush, the house might hear." Alara turned toward them, but they scattered into the alley before she could speak. The unease grew thicker as she walked. Not fear, but recognition, as though the town itself remembered her better than she remembered it. Every street curved toward the woods, where the trees stood too tall and too still, their roots twisting toward the old Harrow land. The silence wasn't emptiness. It was waiting. The people of Harrow's Crossing didn't avoid her out of cruelty. They avoided her because they knew what always came next when a Harrow returned home. Briar Hollow stood at the end of a dirt road swallowed by ivy and thyme, its windows glinting like eyes in the fog. The iron gates were still there, half open, as if the house had been waiting with its breath held. Alara hesitated before crossing the threshold, her hand brushing the cool metal of the gatepost carved with the Harrow crest, a serpent devouring its own tail. Inside, the air was thick and unmoving, the kind of stillness that clung to skin. Dust lay on the marble floors like ash, yet beneath it she could see the faint marks of footprints, too fresh to belong to ghosts. The chandelier above her flickered once, though no one had lit it. She called out softly, her voice vanishing into the high ceilings. No answer. Only the house exhaled, a long, wooden groan as if it recognized her weight. She set her suitcase down and glanced around. The same velvet drapes hung in tatters. The same clock on the landing ticked, slow and uneven, though it had stopped the night her mother disappeared. The faint scent of lilacs still haunted the air, the perfume her mother used to wear, or perhaps the scent of something else that wanted her to think of love. Alara climbed the grand staircase, her hand trailing the rail, the wood warm beneath her palm as though it pulsed faintly with life. Along the wall, portraits stretched in a line. Generations of Harrow women in lace and pearls, faces pale and proud. Their eyes followed her, the artist's brush having captured something too alive, too knowing. Then, as she reached the landing, she saw it. A painting larger than the rest, framed in gold gone black with age. Her breath caught. The woman in the portrait was her, or nearly so. Same dark hair, same tilt of chin, same green eyes that seemed caught mid-blink. But the inscription beneath the portrait froze her blood. Alara Harrow, wife of Silas Harrow. Her father's name. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the frame. The paint was dry, the varnish cracked. This portrait was decades old, impossible in every way. Yet she could see her own reflection in the glass, overlapping the woman's smile until the two faces became one. Behind her, the air shifted, carrying the faint creak of footsteps somewhere above. She turned sharply, but the staircase behind her was empty. The house seemed to hum, a low sound deep in its bones, as though it had been waiting for her to notice. The candle on the table guttered once, and when the flame steadied, the eyes in the portraits no longer looked past her. They looked directly at her, every one of them smiling in the same familiar way that it was nearly midnight when Alara found the key. It had fallen from a loose brick in the study's hearth, landing with a sound far too deliberate to be chance. She knelt and picked it up, a small iron thing shaped like a serpent biting its tail, cold enough to burn her skin. Every locked door in Briar Hollow had whispered temptation since her arrival, but one in particular seemed to breathe with a pulse of its own. The door at the end of the west wing corridor, sealed with a rusted padlock and carved with her father's initials. As she stood before it now, the key trembled in her hand like something alive, eager. The lock gave way with a reluctant sigh, the hinges screaming as the door creaked open to reveal a corridor lined with mirrors draped in black cloth. The air was colder there, damp and sweet, the scent of old roses and decay. She lit a candle and stepped inside, her reflection ghosting faintly in the glass whenever the flame flickered. The walls were papered in faded crimson damask, peeling in long strips that revealed symbols etched into the plaster beneath. Circles within circles, names written in a looping, feminine hand. She traced one with her fingertip and felt the faintest hum beneath it, as if the house itself breathed through those markings. At the corridor's end, she found a room she had never seen before, her father's study, but older somehow, preserved in perfect stillness. On the desk lay rows of leather-bound journals, each embossed with the Harrow crest. She opened one, then another. The handwriting was elegant, familiar, yet the dates reached back nearly 2 centuries. The first entry began, "To preserve what was promised. The daughters must become the wives. The seed never scattered, the line never broken." The words blurred as she read on, detailing rituals, blood pacts, and ceremonies held under red moons. Each generation of Harrow daughters had been wed to the patriarch, not in name but in spirit, binding the bloodline to the house. The journal spoke of the vow of continuance, a curse disguised as devotion, a union that promised immortality through endless inheritance of self. Alara's stomach turned as she found her mother's name scrawled in the later pages, her handwriting replaced by her father's, as if he had taken over her very voice. And then she saw her own name, written not once, but over and over, each repetition descending into a scrawl. Beneath it, in a final trembling hand, the words. She ran before the promise was sealed. The house waits still. The candle guttered. From somewhere deep in the walls came the faintest whisper, not words but laughter. A sound that belonged to the house, not to the living. Sleep came uneasily in Briar Hollow, if it came at all. The house did not rest. It shifted, sighed, and murmured as though dreaming of those who had once lived within its walls. Alara had taken to keeping a candle lit by her bedside, afraid of what the dark might show her. The night it began, the flame burned low and thin, barely keeping the shadows at bay. She had just drifted into that uneasy place between waking and sleep when she heard it. Her name, spoken softly, with a weight of familiarity that turned her blood to ice. Alara. The sound came from the hallway just beyond her door, the voice gentle, almost tender. It was her father's voice. She sat up, every muscle in her body tense. The candle flickered, and the air seemed to grow thick, pressing against her chest. The house groaned, floorboards shifting as if someone, or something, walked the corridor outside. She listened, breath held, heart hammering. Again, the voice called her, closer this time, threaded with affection that made it worse. "Alara, my bride, come home to me." The doorknob rattled softly, a slow, deliberate turn. For a moment, she thought it might simply be the wind, some trick of the old wood. But then she heard the sound that ended all doubt, the rhythm of breathing just beyond the door. She forced herself to stand, every step feeling like it belonged to someone else. The floor was cold beneath her bare feet. She reached for the doorknob but stopped when she felt the faintest heat radiating from it, as if someone's hand had just been there. A thin line of light glowed beneath the door, though she had extinguished every lamp in the hall earlier that evening. Slowly, she backed away, her eyes never leaving that trembling line of gold. Then, the voice spoke again, softer now, almost coaxing. "You were promised, Alara. The blood remembers." Her throat felt tight, her heart beating in her ears. She turned toward the window, half expecting to see nothing but darkness. Instead, across the lawn, she saw a figure standing near the family plot, tall, still, unmistakably shaped like her father. The moonlight caught the outline of his face, pale and waiting. She blinked, and he was gone. But the echo of his voice lingered in the room like smoke. The candle flared suddenly, burning brighter than before, and with that light she saw them, handprints, faint and smudged, pressed against the inside of her door. She didn't scream. She only whispered his name once, testing it against the silence, and the house answered her in a sigh that seemed almost pleased at why the time dawn broke. The house had fallen quiet again, though the silence felt thinner, as if stretched over something restless beneath. Alara hadn't slept. She wandered the halls with the faint courage that comes from exhaustion, searching for signs of life, for proof that she wasn't entirely alone in the house that seemed to breathe with her. It was in the kitchen that she found the old housemaid. The woman sat at the wooden table, her spine bent like a question mark, her thin hands wrapped around a teacup that steamed though no kettle boiled. Her name came to Alara slowly from memory, Mavis. She had been old even when Alara was a child, with eyes so clouded they looked like smoked glass. "Mavis?" Alara whispered, relieved and afraid all at once. The woman looked up, startled, as though recognizing a ghost. "You shouldn't be here," she rasped. "The house remembers." Her voice was cracked and tremulous, the words breaking apart like ice in water. Elara tried to smile, but the old woman flinched from it. "I came because of my father," she said softly. "I think something's wrong." Mavis laughed, a dry, hollow sound that seemed to belong to the walls. "Wrong? Nothing's wrong, child. Everything's just as it always has been. The house keeps its promise. Always." Elara stepped closer. "What promise?" she asked, but Mavis only shook her head, mumbling to herself. Her hands trembled so violently that the tea spilled across the table, spreading like blood across the wood. "You shouldn't have opened the west wing," the old woman said suddenly, her voice sharp now, almost angry. "It smells you on the air again. It knows you've come home." Elara crouched beside her, gripping the arm of her chair. "Who knows? What does?" The old woman leaned forward, her milky eyes focusing for the first time. "The house chooses, same as it always did. Every daughter must marry her father. That's how the blood stays pure, how the house stays alive. But you—" Her lips trembled, and she clutched at Elara's wrist with surprising strength. "You broke the vow. You ran before the promise could be sealed. Now it's hungry, and there's no husband to keep it quiet." Elara's stomach twisted, the words barely making sense, but the terror behind them was unmistakable. Mavis released her, slumping back in her chair, whispering like a prayer. "When the moon bleeds red, it will choose again. It always does." The candle on the counter flickered though there was no wind, and Mavis's eyes darted to the ceiling. "It's listening," she hissed, her voice fading to a thin thread. "Don't let it see you in white." The teacup slipped from her hands and shattered, and the house gave a low, satisfied creak, as though it had been waiting for the warning to be spoken aloud. The warning clung to Elara's thoughts long after Mavis's trembling voice faded into silence. The old woman had retreated to her room, muttering prayers to a god that had long stopped listening to anyone in Briar Hollow. Elara tried to shake the words from her mind. "Don't let it see you in white," but they threaded through every sound in the house, through every creak of the floorboards and whisper of the walls. The moon was climbing now, thin and red as an open wound. The air felt heavier, carrying a sweetness that made her stomach turn. Somewhere deep inside her, she felt the pull again, that faint hum of the house calling her name. She followed it down the hall, past doors that had once led to guest rooms and studies, now warped shut from years of neglect. The trail ended at a door she had never opened before, though she had passed it countless times. It was a pale door, carved with roses and vines, so delicately detailed it almost looked alive. The knob turned easily beneath her hand. Inside, the room was drenched in candlelight. It smelled of wax and lilac, of something old pretending to be beautiful. A single mirror dominated the far wall, tall enough to reflect her entire body. In front of it stood a mannequin dressed in white silk, a wedding gown, its train spilling across the floor like spilled milk. The veil was draped neatly over a chair beside it, and on the vanity, a ring rested in a small velvet box. For a moment she could only stare, her breath caught somewhere between disbelief and dread. The gown was her size. The shoes beside it were her shoes, though she'd never seen them before. Her fingers brushed the lace, and the fabric felt warm, as though someone had just worn it. When she looked up, her reflection seemed slightly wrong, her face paler, her eyes unfocused. Then the reflection blinked, though she hadn't. She stepped back, heart pounding, but her image stayed still, frozen in place. The mirror darkened, rippling like water, and within it she saw another figure. Her father, standing just behind her, smiling faintly, one hand reaching toward her shoulder. She spun around, but the room was empty. Only the candles moved, their flames bowing toward her as if in reverence. She turned back to the mirror. Her reflection had changed again. Now she stood within it wearing the gown, the veil drawn low over her face, her father's shadow beside her, waiting. On the vanity, the ring gleamed brighter, as if the house itself urged her to finish what had been promised. The air thickened, almost sighing her name. The house had prepared everything, the ceremony, the bride, and the waiting groom that no grave had been able to keep. The moment she saw herself in that gown, something inside Alara broke loose. Not fear at first, but a deep and wild refusal. The house pulsed around her, alive with a rhythm that matched her racing heart, the candles leaning toward her as if to hold her in place. She stumbled backward, knocking over the mannequin, the gown collapsing into a heap of silk and dust. The floorboards groaned, a sound almost like anger, and somewhere behind the walls, she thought she heard a low murmur, the hum of voices too many to count. The window on the far side of the room cracked open suddenly, a gust of night air sweeping through and extinguishing every candle. In the dark, her father's voice came again, softer now, coaxing, mournful. You can't run from blood, Alara. You were born to return. Her body moved before her thoughts caught up. She ran, out of the candlelit chamber, down the endless corridors that twisted and looped as if the house was rearranging itself to keep her inside. The portraits blurred in the dark, their eyes glinting as she passed, their mouths seeming to curl into faint, pitying smiles. Her bare feet slapped against the cold floor, her breath catching in the heavy air that seemed to grow thicker the closer she got to the front door. Every shadow lengthened. Every door she passed whispered her name in a voice that wasn't her own. She reached the grand staircase and nearly slipped on the dust that had gathered there. The front door loomed below, its brass handle gleaming faintly in the moonlight that spilled through the windows. The sound of footsteps followed her, steady, calm, perfectly in rhythm with her own. When she stopped, they stopped. When she turned, there was nothing behind her but the empty hall and the echo of her heartbeat. Still, she felt the breath of someone just behind her ear, the faint brush of air that smelled like lilacs and smoke. She reached the door and pulled. It didn't move. She yanked again, harder this time, until her palms ached and her breath came ragged. The lock rattled like laughter. Somewhere upstairs, a door slammed, and the chandelier trembled, scattering light like shards of bone. Come home, my bride, the voice whispered again, this time from everywhere. From the walls, from the floor, from the very air that wrapped around her like a shroud. She turned toward the staircase just as a figure stepped into view, tall, familiar, wearing the same ring she had seen on the vanity. Panic clawed its way through her throat, and with one final desperate surge, she ran through the parlor, past the dying firelight, and out through the broken window, glass slicing her skin as the house screamed her name. The cold night swallowed Alara whole as she fled into the woods, her breath rising in pale bursts against the dark. The air outside felt no freer than the house itself. It clung to her like damp fabric, heavy and unrelenting. Branches clawed at her dress, leaving ribbons of white fabric hanging from the trees as she stumbled through the undergrowth. Behind her, Briar Hollow loomed. No longer just a house but a shadowed silhouette pulsing faintly with light, each window flickering like a watchful eye. She could still hear it, the deep, rhythmic hum that had begun inside its walls, now rolling through the forest like a heartbeat that refused to stop. The farther she ran, the louder it became, as though the house was breathing through her. The moon had risen fully, swollen and red, bleeding its light across the world. The same red Mavis had warned her of. Alara's legs burned, her feet raw and bloodied from the glass. She didn't know where the road was, where the town lay, only that she had to keep moving. Then, from the corner of her vision, she saw the same figure again, her father standing among the trees. His face was pale and soft, eyes glinting with a warmth that wasn't human. When she blinked, he was closer. You can't leave what you are, the voice said, though his lips did not move. The house doesn't let its own stray. She screamed for help that no one heard, her voice breaking against the vast quiet of the woods. The trees began to close around her, their roots rising from the ground like veins seeking to pull her back. The forest itself felt alive, a mere extension of the mansion's will. The air shimmered faintly, and for a moment, the path ahead looked like a hallway again. The same wallpaper, the same flickering candlelight. She shut her eyes and kept running, until her lungs felt as though they'd been scraped raw. When dawn came, the forest was still. The road reappeared, cutting through the mist, and beyond it, the outline of Harrow's crossing. She never made it there. The townsfolk who ventured near the Harrow property that morning found the iron gates closed tight, the vines having grown thick overnight, sealing the entrance as though welded by unseen hands. Yet, in the highest window of Briar Hollow, a new portrait had appeared. The paint was still wet, the likeness perfect. Elara in her wedding gown, veil lifted, eyes open wide. Some said the smile painted on her lips seemed to move when the wind passed, as though she were still breathing, as though the house had simply taken back what was always promised to it.